Contending in this year's elections are two sets of policies based upon the interest of the two great contending classes, most clearly represented in the candidacies of two men of roughly the same age. But that is as far as the similarity goes. In views, policy, purpose, and personal biography, they stand at opposite poles. Gus Hall, outstanding representative and leader of the working class. Ronald Reagan, servant and serpent of the capitalist class. Gus Hall, leader and organizer of steelworkers, advocate of trade unionism, of nationalization to save the jobs, communities, and futures of steelworkers and their families. Ronald Reagan, union buster, scab, advocate of monopolization that is destroying hundreds of thousands of jobs in the basic mass production industries. Gus Hall, a fighter for unity of black and white, of all races and nationalities, of men and women, for progress and democracy, mobilizer of white workers in the struggle against racism. Ronald Reagan, a vicious racist, lead hound of the anti-affirmative action lynch mob in the Injustice Department and Anti-Civil Rights Commission.
We should not be surprised. What else can we expect from a social system that goes all out for profits and against the working people and the poor people?
Comrade Angela Davis is a communist mass leader who has demonstrated through her actions her complete dedication to the struggles of our U.S. multiracial, multinational, male, female, young and older working class. While President Ronald Reagan's policies of deployment of missiles to Europe, increased military aid to El Salvador, and U.S. troops in Lebanon bring the world closer to nuclear disaster, Comrade Angela Davis continually speaks to hundreds and thousands of people all over this country at rallies, demonstrations, college campuses, and on the radio and television for peace, for removing U.S. missiles from Europe, for no military aid to Central America, and for U.S. troops out of Lebanon. While Reaganism seeks to bust unions, close plants, force concessions, Comrade Angela Davis supports and joins picket lines of strikers, joins in protests of the unemployed, and rallies against plant closures.
Ms. Davis, glad to meet you. I've heard a lot about you and of your work, and I hope you continue to fight what is right. And I would like to have your autograph if you don't mind. For my son, John.
We got to put the people's needs first. People profit.
The situation is getting worse.
People profit. 'Cause the billions that are made while we're underpaid gonna force a change. Would people profit?
Gus Hall was born in 1910 on the Iron Range of Minnesota. As a youth, he joined the Young Communist League and later the Communist Party, of which his working-class parents were charter members. Growing up in the midst of fierce class struggle, teenager Gus became a militant trade unionist laboring in logging camps throughout the state. His brilliant leadership qualities took on special dimension during the steelworkers' organizing drive in the 1930s. United Steelworkers President Phil Murray called Gus Hall the most able organizer in the Steelworkers Union. Gus Hall served in the Navy during the anti-fascist World War II. When the McCarthyite Cold War began, Hall, a member of the Communist Party's National Committee, was sent to prison in 1951 for 8 years under the notorious Smith Act for the so-called crime of thinking Marxist-Leninist ideas. For the last 25 years, Gus Hall has been General Secretary of the Communist Party USA. His hundreds of books, articles, speeches, his numerous appearances on TV, radio, and public forums across the United States has shaped him as one of the leading theoreticians, teacher, and tactician throughout the world communist and working class movements, as well as one of the best-known popular leaders in our own people's struggle for peace, equality, justice, social progress, and for a socialist USA. Angela Davis, born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, lived on Dynamite Hill, as the black families called it, the site of the 1963 bombing of a black church that killed 4 Sunday school girls. Angela knew these little girls, their families, and the bitter fruits of racist violence. It was the realization that only the most radical solutions will vanquish racism and repression that led Angela Davis to join the Communist Party USA. Today, she is a member of its Central Committee. Angela Davis, a brilliant scholar, has never placed her career above the needs of the Afro-American people and all other oppressed and exploited workers. Her militant and open political activities in the 1960s against police repression and for prison reform led then Governor Ronald Reagan to fire her from her teaching job at UCLA and initiate the process that led to the frame-up attempt on her life in one of the most spectacular trials of the century. Angela Davis is the author of numerous books and articles on black liberation, political prisoners, the struggle for women's equality, on U.S. history and culture, as well as on philosophy and aesthetics. In addition to her heavy teaching schedules at 3 colleges in San Francisco, Angela Davis is a tireless campaigner and has spoken to massive audiences in practically all states of the Union.
The main task before us in 1984 is the defeat of Reagan and the policies of the Reagan administration. And because we have come so close to the possibility of a global nuclear conflagration, this is the most important election of this century.
The big lie, evil empire, anti-communism continues as the main ingredient of the Reagan's ideological offensive. There is nothing Reagan talks about without tacking on some aspect of the big lie. The monstrous myth of the so-called Soviet military threat continues as the basis for Reagan's hysteria propaganda campaign. The Reaganite policies of exporting counter-revolution, the accompanying covert and overt undeclared wars, the acts of official terrorism have emerged as frontline policies of the Pentagon-Reagan administration.
The anti-communist foreign policies of the Reagan administration are no less dangerous than their domestic policies. If he is reelected, we may confidently expect the transformation of Central America into another Vietnam. Nicaragua may be invaded as Grenada was invaded last October, and the reactionary government in El Salvador will be propped up on a permanent basis by U.S. military aid and assistance in order to continue to thwart the will of the Salvadoran people and their goal of creating an equitable society. We cannot afford, my sisters and my brothers, 4 more years of a president who is determined to destroy the African National Congress of South Africa and the Southwest African People's Organization of Namibia.
I have spent my whole life as a worker in the steel mills, railroads, and lumber camps, as a union organizer and a founder of the United Steelworkers of America. I was involved in the great battles that made trade unions legal in struggles to win a better life for the working class and people of our country against the monopoly corporations. Now I see all these victories and advances in great jeopardy at the hands of the Reaganites. The Reagan corporate offensive is working overtime. The attacks on the working class and trade union movement aim to destroy the legal and institutional structure that has provided a legal foundation for the trade union movement since the New Deal days. All this is going on while the Reaganite-controlled media worked night and day to create an anti-labor, anti-union atmosphere to support their anti-working class offensive.
Well, of course, it's no secret that Reagan has increased the profits of big business. If that's what he calls a recovery, well, he definitely has brought that about. But what kind of recovery is it when 40 million people continue to live in poverty? What kind of recovery is it when 10 million people remain in the ranks of the unemployed, the officially unemployed? And I'm sure that if you ask any unemployed auto worker or steel worker whose plants remain closed, they don't want to hear anything about a recovery.
The structural crisis is adding a new dimension to the ravaging effects of racism, because the sick industries and devastated communities have large numbers of Afro-American workers. The racist impact is severe, because the economic upturn is bypassing these industries and communities. The economic recovery also follows the racist path of discrimination.
No more Reagan here. We are going to change this world. Yeah, no more Reagan here. We are going to change this world. No more Reagan here. We are going to change this world. Forever and ever, we're going to change this world.
Reagan, should be defeated, and the fact is that if these policies are continued, the very existence of civilization is at stake. Because if these policies continue, nuclear war will become inevitable, and there's no question it will be the last war, because it will literally wipe out civilization. But he should be defeated for his domestic policies, and the fact is that the standard of living has been cut during this administration like no other administration in history. He must be defeated for the racism that he promotes and pushes and creates the atmosphere for racism. And therefore, for the very self-interest of the people, he should be defeated, and for the peace of the world, he should be defeated.
The Reagan administration, while it is the most racist, the most sexist, the most warmongering administration, is also the most anti-labor administration in recent years. As a result of the policies of the Reagan administration, a consistent union busting strategy has been adopted. Of course, this is the first election campaign in which labor has adopted a real independent stance.
Of course, we think that Reagan is against unions. Yeah, I think that Reagan is against the working class, period. And I think that through unionization, we can better the lot of the working class.
March for union jobs. Without a union, there is nothing. The union speaks for the people.
I think it's important that we demonstrate labor's power. It's a tremendous demonstration of labor's unity, which is going to be necessary if we're going to turn around some of the anti-labor policies of the present administration and demonstrate to the Democratic Party that unless they do come out and take issues that are of interest to labor, that they're going to have a hard time getting labor's backing. And that's what's going to be essential to defeating Reagan in this election.
Well, the solution, of course, is to defeat this administration and the Reaganites who are in Senate and in Congress, and that would be the greatest contribution that the people of the United States could make to the world peace and to our own being. And to do that, we have to build a unity of the people, a anti-Reagan a coalition of forces. And let me just say that if all of the sectors of the anti-Reagan movement focus on the central question of defeating Reagan, I think that's very possible that Reagan can be defeated. But if the different sectors focus on their immediate perspective and problems and forget the main focus, and that is to defeat Reagan and Reaganism, it'll be a very difficult thing to achieve.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
In this most crucial election in our history, the power of the truth that Hall and Davis are not afraid to voice, their party's radical programs to solve the country's devastating domestic and foreign policy problems can make the difference in rousing enough working people to vote to dump Reagan.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest until...
Yes, it's a unique role, and no other party or group can play the same role as our party does in these elections. And very often people ask, that will we not take votes away from the opposition to Reagan? And of course some will, but that's not the main point or the main contribution that the party makes. The main contribution is that, for instance, if people believe, which many still do, Reagan's, propaganda about the big lie of anti-communism, if they believe that there really is a Soviet threat, and if people believe and fall for the racism of the Reagan administration, if people believe that the trade union movement is too big and too strong, if people believe, for instance, that the economic upturn is going to continue and that we'll have great prosperity, if they believe these things, they're going to vote for Reagan. And our special contribution is to prove and to expose and to show that the big lie is the big lie and that there is no Soviet threat, and therefore people will be released from that assumption, and therefore they will vote against Reagan. The same thing on our role in the question of struggle against racism, that we make a very special contribution in letting the people understand that this is an instrument of corporate profits, and therefore they must not follow the racist policies or support the racist policies of Reagan.
As communist candidates, Gus Hall and I are able to speak to many people who otherwise would not be interested in involving themselves in the electoral campaign to oust Reagan in November. We are raising the kinds of demands that directly reflect the interest and the needs of workers, of poor people, of single mothers, of black people, Latinos, Native American Indians, Asians, seniors, and youth. We're talking about the need for full employment, and we make the point that that there are many people who would not become involved in democratic politics or would not become involved in the movement to defeat Reagan unless they saw the potential for achieving a full employment program, unless they saw the potential for achieving unemployment compensation for all unemployed workers, first-time job seekers as well as from job to job. We're speaking to people who want to see something done about racism, who will become active in the effort to defeat Reagan if they see that movement taking shape as a movement which is also going to fight for the criminalization of racism and anti-Semitism.
For the first time, the people of the United States, really the majority of the people, because we do speak to millions now by radio and television and the press, for the first time they're going to, for instance, hear that the Reagan policy of terrorism and undeclared wars in Central America is in support of big business profits, the U.S. corporations that are making big profits by low wages and raw materials in these countries. Well, for the first time they're going to find out, for instance, again, as I said, that racism is an instrument of corporate a profit. And for the first time they're going to find out that socialism is a system in which workers are the dominant influence and a dominant force, And in that sense, socialism is a working class, a kind of society. So for the first time, the majority of our people are going to hear about these kind of things because other candidates don't. So therefore, we have a very special role to play in this election in bringing clarity and understanding to millions of people that will not otherwise get such an understanding or that clarity. Qualitatively, we are different, and we deal with problems differently, more basically, and therefore, you know, people understand that, and therefore our influence, I think, is greater. And the bourgeois politicians, they use cliches, and you watch them, and some of the cliches are clever and so on, but you hear them and then you forget them. While we explain, you know, more basic processes and explain why we have problems in this country, why there is a war drive, why there is poverty, why there is racism, and this makes a much deeper imprint on the people's mind, thought patterns than other politicians do.
The Communist Party's campaign is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. Because you see, many people who may not find themselves excited about Mondale and Ferraro can get excited by a program which calls for the immediate withdrawal of the Pershing II and cruise missiles from Europe, a program which calls for the ratification of SALT II and a no first strike pledge to match that of the Soviet Union. People can get excited about a demand to end the undeclared wars against Nicaragua and El Salvador. They can get excited about the demand to institute economic sanctions against the brutal apartheid government in South Africa. Unemployed workers will come into a campaign to defeat Reagan, which calls for the reduction of the military budget by half and a rechanneling of those funds into the rebuilding of our cities and the restoration and expansion of social programs.
Let me just say that to run a presidential campaign isn't cheap, and everything comes very high priced, whether you want to get on radio or television or newspaper ads or anything else that costs a lot of money. And of course, we are a working class party, and our money must come from, you know, working people generally, and therefore if you want to see the communist election campaign get on television, get on radio, well, you can do so by donating, and that's the way you can really participate and contribute to this great campaign. I just saw where the Republicans announced a special media campaign, and it's a $47 million extravaganza that they're going to put on television and radio alone.
Really? $47 million?
$47 million. That's just on television and radio.
We got to put the people's needs first. People for profit.
The situation is getting worse.
People for profit.
Cause the billions that are made while we're underpaid gonna force a change. Would people for profit?
Brothers and sisters all across the nation. People for profit.
There's no way we can keep up with this inflation.
People for profit.
Cause the profits and the prices are way too high for the poor to survive. Put people for profit.
Riches of the world belong to everyone.
you and me.
People,
Fit for profit, everybody here.
people,
Fit for profit,